today. Surprise! Oh, I guess you ain't that surprised because it's lesson number 22. 2-2, roadie with a stutter, as I used to say in the old beer bingo days. But no, it be lesson number 22. We be back again and again and again. Keep going for 22 times. It's like that birthday thing we sing. Is he 1? No. Is he 2? No. And then by the end of it you go, my goodness, will he just stop? But no, we're here at 22. Give me an R. Give me another R. Put them all together, and they indeed do spell R. I figured you'd be ready to answer that question in HSC now. When they go R and R, what does that spell? You'll be there going, oh, that's it, because all those guys now finishing school, ready to study and put their pirate knowledge to good use, I imagine. Don't forget to write answers on the back of your patch. That's what I always say. All right, so what are we doing today? Oh, we're doing all manner of things. We're looking at some of the mysteries of the deep today. But I thought I'd start with a few more of these wordy things, you know, talking to things like, you heard the expression, empty your coffers. Does it mean like give all your money away or spend all your money and all that kind of stuff? You know that? Well, a coffer, right? That's what we used to call a treasure chest. Right? So that makes sense. Empty your coffers, just empty your treasure chest, right? So that's where that comes from, as we tell it. And the gangplank. People talk about the gangplank, you know, they talk about walking the gangplank and all that kind of stuff. Walk the plank, right? Well, the gangplank, if you catch a ferry and that kind of stuff now, you'll see it. All right? That's just the ramp, the movable ramp they put out down to the wharf so you can walk in and out easy, right? So you don't have to climb down ropes and all that kind of stuff. You just go up the gangplank, right? And they just pull it in and pull it out. And that's what a gangplank was, right? Of course, if you were walking the gangplank, that meant they'd put it out and you were walking out and fall into the sea because there's nothing on the other side. You know, that was as a punishment. They just tie it off. But generally, the gangplank is just that bit there like that. Another expression you would have heard, right, is many hands make light work. You heard that one? Many hands make light work. You think, oh yeah, that sort of makes sense and all that kind of stuff. Well, if you think maritime-wise, right, piratey-wise, it makes even more sense because hands is what we call sailors, right? They call their hands, the ship's hands, right? That's what, you know, do that. So many hands make light work. So you got more people doing the job. It goes faster. That's what it's all about. Many hands make light work. Another sailor term. We've heard this from stem to stern, right? You said stem to stern. Remember we would talk about your port, remember? Your starboard, you know, the bow and the aft. Well, the stem, right? The stem is actually right up at the bow of the ship, right? It's the piece of wood that goes up at the front and all the boards attached to it. That's the stem. So it's a very pointy bit of the ship. From stem to stern means the whole thing. If you're doing something from stem to stern, that's covering the whole thing, right? Another thing you might have heard that actually maritime is wallop. You heard about giving things a good wallop? Have you ever, I mean, it's a kind of tactile word, right? So it feels like wallop. It feels like something you can actually do, right? It feels like you're slapping them or something that goes clocks in their head, don't it? You go, clock. Like, you know, I was going to say maybe like a cutlass, but cutlass is more of a clang than a wallop. Wallop's more like one of those, like a belaying pin, actually. If you could wallop somebody with a belaying pin, I reckon, so that wallop sort of sound like that. Clop, practice that, you know. And make sure when you do it, you're swinging into things, right? That's how I always like to swing into these things, right? So, yeah, wallop. So where does wallop come from? Well, back, way back, right? The French, they burned down the city of Brighton. They burned it down, right? Little dastardly buggers they were, right? They burned it down. And King Henry VIII was in charge of England that time. And he got quite narky about it, right? And so he went to an admiral and says, I want you to take vengeance on the French. And do you know what that you know what that admiral's name was? Who got the vengeance, right? His name was Admiral Wallop. And he gave him a right wallop, and he did so much damage that ever after that, whenever he gave somebody a good clack on the side of the head, they call it a wallop in his honour. So that's an interesting one as well. I'm not sure if I've done taken aback before, but it's a good one because I've been taken aback by stuff. And that was the old square riggers, all right? So when the sails lost wind or the wind changed and they flapped back against the mast there like that, all right? And the arms and all that sort of stuff, right? When they did that, that would be flapping back there, the yard arm and all that sort of stuff. So when it flapped back, right? That was when you were taken aback because the ship would actually jolt backwards and all that kind of stuff. And that's where that expression, getting taken aback, comes from. Now, another expression, right? Another expression that you might have heard, a word used a lot, is fluke. All right, what is a fluke? Well, fluke's got no definitions, but you know anchors, right? You know the shape of anchors, they go down like that, right?
and then they curl at the bottom, and then they got little triangle-y bits on the end. You remember if you ever see one just sitting outside or a picture of one, you look and they got a little triangle-y bit on the end of the two curved at the bottom, right? Those two triangle bits, right? They're called the flukes, right? They're flukes, all right? And they're the bits when you throw the anchor in, right? It's the flukes that actually grab all the stuff, right? And they catch up, and that's what stops the ship from moving, right? Because it grabs hold of the ground and stays there. But those things are called flukes, right? And when you put an anchor in, right, it doesn't always catch. Oh, me and a friend Mikey, right? We had a sailing ship, me and Mikey, right? And we've gone off, right? We partnered her there, left it all anchored. It's only a little sloop, right? And we've gone off quite happily, you know, gone for a swim, done all sorts of things, hang around, had a bit of a picnic, done all sorts of things, right? Now we wandered back to the ship and going, hey, that ship, isn't it funny, you know, with the side, we look out to sea and, you know, different light makes things seem further away than they did before. And now we looked at each other and realised that it had actually drawn its anchor and it kept floating away. And it was floating right over the other side of the bay we were in. And it was heading towards the rocks. So we've run like maniacs, run like maniacs. Jumped in a rowboat, right? Jumped in a rowboat. And then we paddled. Paddled some more and some more. Like that, I was teaching you in lesson 2, 3, whatever that was, right? And we've grazed along. And eventually just jumped into the boat and just managed to save her, right? From coming up on the rocks, all right? And that's because it got pretty fluky there and they didn't hook up, right? But that's where fluke comes from. It's actually from the anchors, right? Those little things there that catch on, right? What about there she blows? There's another one you've heard. There she blows when you see someone coming. Well, that's an obvious one too. That's the whales, because you see whales, right? And the spouts go up. There she blows. That's the whale blowing their holes there, right? There, that kind of stuff. Oh, and pooped. You've been pooped, exhausted, had enough, right? Well, the poop, right? The poop deck. At the back of the ship, right? When it's got the raised bit up at the back. We haven't got it on the beer ships. You've seen the pirate ships there, right? The old ships. We've got the raised deck at the back. That's the poop deck, right? The poop is actually the back part of the ship, right? Like that bit about back to the stern, right? It's a deck to the stern. And the right is the poop deck, right? And so, where pooped becomes, the ship becomes pooped, like that, exhausted and all that kind of stuff, right? If you are sailing before the wind, right, which means the wind's behind you, right, in a gale, and so you get there, you're going flat out, the wind's behind you and that kind of stuff. If the water should crash over the back of the boat, right, that expression for that is you're pooped, right? The ship's pooped. And actually what happens, because it's down there and submerges and it stops and all the wind, you lose all the wind, and it's just like being exhausted, you just collapse and all that kind of stuff, and you're in a right bit of trouble if you get pooped. And that's where that comes from. All right, another naval expression. It's used in all sorts of things, like for being exhausted and all that kind of stuff. And so, you know, that's what, sort of where it all comes from. Now, the last thing I was going to talk about was a bit of more sailing stuff, right? Is ballast, right? What is ballast, right? All right. Well, ballast, right? So this ship in here, right, is not got ballast. You can see. See how high up it is in the water, right? It's quite higher up in the water, right? So when you load up a ship, it sinks, right? Because it gets more in it, it sinks right down and displaces the water, right? And it keeps it above float, right? But it floats, that goes down to about here, right? When it's fully submerged in the water. You can see like that's the little pencil line across there, right? Then some clever blighter worked out how much you can load the ship, that it's actually balanced for sailing, right? For that kind of stuff, and not so tippy. Because if you're out of the water there, you got more service and become more tippy and more in balance, right? Because there's too much weight up top. So you really, ideally, you need to be down to this plimsoll line, right? That's where it is. Very cool plimsoll developed all that. And so when you load it up, when you're full of goods and stuff, and treasure and all sorts of things like that, well, you naturally sink down to that level, right? But if you're not got the treasure in, and when you're going out and all that, what we used to do is get stuff called ballast, right? Which is basically big heavy stuff, right? Big heavy stuff, put in the hull of the ship down the bottom, and that would reduce us down so we'd be sailing at the best rate. And that's how you'd sail the best way, because you're full of ballast, right? Modern ships use water. They pump in water and pump out water and all that kind of stuff. But old days we used to use heavy stuff, right? Heavy stuff. In fact, if you go to Newcastle, right? Harbour of Newcastle up there, right? The top part there, right? In Scotland, there's a big bit of there. And that whole the land there is actually old ballast, right? The ships used to come over, right? From California and places like that and go sail around. And they would actually empty out all their ballast. They'd come over and pick up coal over there. And they would dump it all out there and then fill it with coal and go back again. And so they end up using all that and to make it to redevelop, right? But that's what ballast is, right? You ever hear about ballast, right? It's just heavy stuff that weighs you down. And you have it in ships right now. It makes you sail better if you're down on that level low, because, you know, up there you're unstable, more unstable and all that kind of stuff, and you don't want to tip over and all that kind of stuff. We talk about tipping over. Now, I'm going to talk now about mermaids and monsters, all right? Mermaids and monsters, some of the legends of the deep, mermaids and monsters. So I'm going to talk about mermaids first, all right? Now, what is a mermaid? Lots of people talk about mermaids, what a little mermaid. So a mermaid, basically, if you've been hiding under a rock, maybe you're a crab, or something like that, and you might know the scene. Mermaid is a aquatic creature with a head and body of a person. And then like a fishy tail at the bottom, right? Fishy tail at the bottom, right? And mermaid, right? Well, mer is an old word, right? For the sea. Mer means sea in Old English, right? And maid means lass, of course. Lass, and it still does, right? It used to mean lass, still does. All right, mermaid. So mermaid, that's what it is, right? That's where that comes from, okay? And now, we have a strange relationship, humans, with mermaids, We see them as good and bad, right? They're either, the sign of beauty, healing, and wisdom, or they're monstrously evil and violent and all that sort of stuff, that kind of stuff. And vengeful and, danger and all that kind of stuff. They're all that kind of things like that, where they're taking sailors to their doom. That's the kind of thing they are, good and bad, they seem like that kind of thing. Remember the story, right? The story of Alexander the Great, right? He was a great soldier, right? That took over the known world at the time, right? Back then in ancient times, they used to do that. Well, his sister was supposed to have passed away, right? And when she passed away, she became a mermaid, right? And she used to stop ships and she would ask them, "How is Alexander?" Right? And the ship's captains would have to say, "Alexander is going well, he lives, and he's conquered the world." And if they said that, she'd let him go by. But if they didn't, she'd call a big storm and smite the ship and smash it all up. And that's what she would do. And that was it. And that kind of relationship at the sea, that violence and all that kind of stuff. And there's so many countries, like they're either goddesses or sirens leading us to our doom, and the sailors and all that kind of stuff. There's all sorts of things we had with them. And all over the world they had legends of them, right? The Greeks, the Romans, the Russians, Southeast Asia, everywhere basically had, the Scottish, the Irish, they'd all had these legends of mermaids. So they were all over the place. Everybody had them. Didn't matter. They grew up separately, but they all had these stories of mermaids, right? Sailors, we love them, right? Well, we have them as figureheads, right? Up the front of the Beatrice there, you might not be able to see it. There's just a little pale shape there of our figurehead, right? The figurehead is at the front of the boat. It's the head there that just sits there and looks regal and all that. And figurehead, I think I covered it in the word stuff before about where it comes from and all that kind of stuff. But that was it. We'd have him there. And we'd hope that the mermaid would give us safe passage through the sea and bring us back home. And that's why the mermaid was there, right? The old figurehead. Okay. So, now, modern people think that maybe the mermaid, right, was actually people getting confused with the sea cows, the dugongs and the manatees. Oh, the huge manatees. That's right, the manatees. Because they're big fish, right, that used to eat things around the water. They'd be vegetarian type diets and all that kind of stuff, and they'd be around all the time. And there's lots of similarities between them and the mermaids, so they think maybe there's mistakes because, especially the dugongs, right? They got down face, like, how porpoises and that have noses that are pointy. Well, they don't, they had faces that are down, so they look more flat and more human-like, right? So there's that kind of thing. And they didn't have any hind limbs, right? They just had a pair of flippers at the front, but no hind limbs, and they were smooth, right? And they were very pale skin, especially when they were young, right? And they had no dorsal fin at the back, like, the sharks and the dolphins. They had none of that sort of stuff, right? So they were smooth, and so they had that more shape, basically the shape of a human looking there. And they sort of had an hourglassy figure as well. They had that sort of shape. So they thought, they'd be human like that, I guess. And also, right, they'd be mammals. So they feed their young milk, right? And not like cows and that, where they have like 4 teats. They'd have 2 teats, like a human person, right? So they would look like a human feeding their young and that kind of stuff. So maybe that's what the confusion comes from, when they're feeding their young. They used to see the sailors would go past and they'd see them feeding their young, and that's maybe there was. And they're usually in the shallows as well, right? So that's where they could be lured into the shallows, because if you see them feeding there and you think it's deeper, it's actually quite shallow because they're quite big animals, but it's quite shallow as they used to keep in. So maybe that was a dangerous thing, and that's what they thought it was. And there was also, though, curious and smart creatures, so they would actually go around the ships and check them out and see what was going on. And they would know, they had memories and stuff like that, remember things, so maybe they came back to the same ship regularly. And you can see how a mermaid thing could have developed, right? That sort of legend of the mermaids, or maybe that's true. Who knows, all right. And when now we've done with mermaids, we'll talk about that most fierce of beastie, the most scariest of all these legendary creatures, the Kraken. Right, the Kraken's got lots of publicity lately, so you probably know all about the Kraken. Well, the Kraken, he has to be a scary beastie with lots of limbs, all these limbs, what are you talking about? And they could reach up higher than the marsh, and they would grab the ships and drag them back down and eat all the sailors and all that kind of stuff, and be very scary sort of thing. Even the water, when there was Kraken being swimming around, they would create these whirlpools or big washes of sea that would cause and knock ships and knock people overboard and all that kind of stuff. So the Kraken be a scary, scary beastie, right? Early on, right, lots of legends on these are too, right back to the ancient Greeks as well, people would see them. Early days, they thought it was more crab-like in the creatures, then it became more of the octopus. Later on, they thought they might have been giant squids, been wrestling with whales and stuff like that. But the Kraken be a legendly scary beast, we talk about, right, that kind of stuff. But with all these magic beasties and that stuff, it could well have been things like pirates trying to scare people off. Remember we talked about Blackbeard, there were people. Now, if we didn't want people to come to our treasure islands, we'd like to talk to people and to build up the story of it. You're not going to travel there because all the sirens will get you, all the Kraken will get you. So, the more you spread these stories, the better it is. In fact, map makers, as they say in the land. Sometimes you get a bit of fish caught in the back of your head, and that's what slap on the back of the side of your head with the fish, and it clears you up. But, all right, map makers, right? Where there was bits of land, right? If they had a bit of land, where there was a bit of, when they were doing the big sea maps and all that, the old map makers, right? If they had a better area, right, that might be rocky and your ships run aground a lot, often they'd stick a picture of a mermaid there on the map, right? And if they had a place that was known for its storms and ships being lost and all that kind of stuff, like Bermuda Triangle or places like that, well, then they'd have a picture of the Kraken on there, right? So the people looking at the map would go, I don't want to go there, I might get caught in the Kraken and all that. But really, it was just signaling places of danger and all that kind of stuff. But some sailors still believe it. They say, right, that Captain Blackbeard's log had a message in there about seeing mermaids in one particular place and said we should never sail there because there are mermaids there and all that kind of stuff. Of course, me, myself, I've never seen a mermaid. I reckon it's because any time I get close, the mermaid gets embarrassed and swims off because it sees my ship's bottom. That'd be right. Anyway, that'd be some of the mysteries and marvels you can have at the sea. All these things that we have, and all these stories and words and stuff like that. So we're covering all this in our classes. And we've done 22, so I think you should give yourself a clap, because a round of applause, all that sort of stuff, because you survived this long. I don't know how you survived this long. We've been in lockdown. They're finding reasons why we should get out of it. One of them is because otherwise these pirate things will just keep on going and going. And we're going to mermaids and Kraken. Where to next? Where to next? That's something I ask myself every day. But right now, I think it's time I pipe us all down and we kick back for a bit of relaxing. Maybe we'll sing a shanty, or listen to a jig, or do something like that. Or maybe we'll just put our feet up and have a little Dr. Rum, just to relax in the evening. But for now, I'd like to say good night, or as I have done a few times, arrivederci, which be Italian for, I guess, see you later. But I'm going to go with purpose down now, because this is the end of lesson number 22! 23 next year. 23, lucky 23, we always say. Not sure why, but I always say it, and I've said it again, so that makes it always. Good boy! Arr!